First, I'm just going to let you know a bit about compassionate conservation, which my lecture focuses on. And the Center for Compassionate Conservation is where I did my externship. So just give you background on that. Then I'll talk to you for 5 minutes about my externship. And then we'll go through my case study, and hopefully there's time for questions. So like I said, my externship was at the Center for Compassionate Conservation in Sydney. My mentor was Dr. Daniel Ramp, who's the director of the center. And compassionate conservation builds the welfare of individual wildlife into conservation practice to improve outcomes for individuals, species, and ecosystems. And so this provides new solutions to previously intractable conservation challenges, just like conservation medicine, and it has a commitment to improving ethical standards in conservation research and practice. There's 4 guiding principles to compassionate conservation, which we focus on for all of our research. The first is do no harm. The second is individuals matter. So we're not just looking at population levels, we're also looking at the individual animals. We value all wildlife, whether they're native or introduced, feral or not. And peaceful coexistence between humans and animals. And all these pictures are from my camera tracks. A lot of them are. This is a gray kangaroo. So the title of my externship was Tracking the Ecological Restoration of a Newly Implemented Wildlife-Friendly Alliance near Cobar, New South Wales. This is a picture of my field site. We stayed in these shearers' quarters. It was pretty glampy compared to other field sites. And the location is Cobar. So that's about 10 hours drive west of Sydney. Cobar, the Shire, it's kind of like a county, is about the size of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut combined. Our study area, the entire area is about the size of Rhode Island within that shire. And so basically the Center for Compassionate Conservation team, along with an environmental consulting company that runs carbon farming projects on the sheep farms in this area, joined together with the landholders with the idea that we're going to create a region of this country region of Australia that no longer uses lethal management for wildlife, with the idea that we can restore apex predators. So dingoes in Australia are like our wolves. They're apex predators. They predate on smaller predators as well as herbivores. And we're hoping that by restoring the dingo colonies in these areas, we could reduce predators such as foxes and cats, and also reduce grazing pressure on the land and improve carbon stocks. So I went for the beginning collection or data to see what animals are left and figure out where we're starting our baseline. Yeah, our baseline. So I did this in 2 ways. Camera trapping, we're looking, like I said, for dingoes. Didn't find any in 18,000 photos. We're waiting for the second round of photos to come in right now from some other properties. And we're also looking for, actually, I think on the sheep farm there were more goats than there were sheep, and the goats are feral. They actually don't farm the goats themselves. But what we look for in the goats is the coloring content. You can actually analyze the colors of their coat, and I can tell you the predation pressures on the goats. So less predation pressure, they are more black and white. I don't know how they figured that out. But so you can take also the photos and put them into R, which is a stats package program, and you can analyze things like patterns, activity patterns, and abundance, things like that. And the other thing was scat collection. This is a map of my sample points on Pine Ridge, the property that I was spending my time at. I drew a 2-meter radius circle at each point and counted all of the food there. Those are really long, fun games. And that's the rite of passage for all graduate students sitting on their ground and counting food forever. So this was a really, really valuable experience, life-changing, I really think. Working with landholders and Australian wildlife experts was just completely mind-blowing. But I found myself really frustrated. I found that there are many conflicting values in how we protect our wildlife and how we protect our livestock. And we need to better understand what these values are in order to address human-wildlife conflict. And so there's 3 objectives or 3 points that I really want to make when I go into my case study, because that's the transition I'm going to make now. I actually changed my entire case study because I was so frustrated. I really wanted to put my energy into something that was meaningful to me, and so I changed it at the end of July. Don't do that, future class. what I wanted to talk to you guys about is that there's generally confusion in how we engage with nature in a human-induced planet in the Anthropocene, like the title says. And this confusion comes to us because we have conflicting values that drive the decisions that we make. And we're not recognizing all the values, and we use heuristics that help us make our decisions. And so people with similar objectives can actually come to completely different solutions for conservation issues because of the values that they express and the ones that they recognize and the ones that they ignore. So when we do have examples of success, it's because everybody is very explicit about their objectives and they're explicit about their values. So by engaging in compassion and having empathy for nature and recognizing that we should coexist and not view nature as other, we can come to better conservation solutions that take into consideration all forms of life on our planet. And compassionate conservation uses this kind of paradigm. We engage in both conservation and welfare and are very explicit about all of the values that we use to make our conservation policy. So I basically decided that this is really important to me. I'm going to change my case study, and the next day, it was literally the next day, I saw an ABC landline, it's their ABC station, episode on a program on Pelorus Island. Pelorus Island is up by Townsville. It's a beautiful island. It's 4 square kilometers. It's off the coast, and it's in the Great Barrier Reef. It's the only island out of the entire Palm Islands group that the Hinchinbrook Shire is responsible for instead of the national parks. It looks kind of like this. This is the island next to it. It's actually so small I couldn't find a picture of it. It's a literal rainforest, so it has 70% canopy cover, and it's within 2 kilometers of the ocean, obviously. And it's a threatened ecosystem, a lot of threatened birds. Very, very beautiful area. They also have goats. And goats were put on this island, maybe 100 years ago or so. It was there to provide shipwrecked sailors and lighthouse keepers with food. They don't have any natural predators on this island, so there's a lot of them. I think there's about 300. And they are said to be consuming all the vegetation on there. There's runoff into the Great Barrier Reef, into the reefs around this area. It's a very big scuba diving island. So, sorry about that little quote, but they decided to use dingoes to help remove these goats. And when I first saw this episode on TV, I was like, wow, that's awesome. They're gonna colonize dingoes. It's top-down species management. This is exactly what we want. And then this is the title to the article, and I'm like, I don't really get it. And at the end of the episode, they said that they're embedding the dingoes with pellets of 1080 poison, so that at the end of 2 years, if they aren't able to hunt the dingoes will die of poisoning from under their skin. And my jaw dropped, and I ran to my mentor and was like, I don't understand why don't I agree with this? We agree with top-down species management, but why all of a sudden do I now feel so conflicted with this program and think it's so horrible? So just to kind of give a background on it, we have a bunch of conservation issues and a bunch of welfare issues in this program. So we're looking at protecting native species, removing non-native species, and preserving a fragile and threatened ecosystem. And then there's also welfare issues, so killing dingoes, the implications of trapping, relocating, and releasing the dingoes, and the implications of using dingoes to kill goats. And so we ask, do the methods or decisions to address the conservation issues harm or threaten the welfare of the animals involved? And we ask these questions by asking ethical questions. So ethics is coming to understand how we should behave towards and relate to others. And so we ask ethical questions by analyzing the value systems we use and looking at statements such as, we should protect this park because, we ought to remove these animals because, and we want to know, are these appropriate? Are these ethical arguments for our conservation decisions okay? So I'm basically parsing through now for my case study, I'm parsing through a lot of the statements. So I've done research on all the gray literature that's been produced through this. Luckily now, and you'll see in a second, they've actually canceled the program, which we're really happy about. So I'm parsing through all of the quotes and looking for implicit and explicitly stated value statements. So for example, this is the Hinchinbrookshire mayor, and he says, we have an obligation as the trustees of this land to control and eradicate pests. Then we have Ben Allen, who's the head wildlife ecologist on this project. And though he doesn't say we ought or we should, he says it's an attempt to restore this island. So saying we ought to restore it to before there were goats. And then Mark Townend, who's the CEO of the RSPCA, he's looking at the welfare of the goats. We shouldn't be putting goats at the risk of dingoes in 2016. This is a wrong attitude. Thinking that the goats are larger animals, so dingoes will not cause them a quick death by any means. You have comments by the public on petition. Most of the comments were about the inhumane treatment of the dingoes, why you would embed a dingo with a 1080 pellet. And then lastly, Dr. Stephen Miles, who's the Minister of the Environment in Queensland, when he canceled the program, he basically said, you're threatening some stone curlews, so some birds. So how do we disentangle the conflicting value systems that justify our conservation decisions? And what happens when we don't use appropriate justification? In the case of the birds, using them as a justification, another wild dog chief officer in Queensland said, well, that's why we shouldn't have wild dogs in any of our national parks. And so he's using it in a complete opposite way that the Center for Compassionate Conservation is interested in using dingoes. And how can we apply a compassionate conservation approach to solving issues like this? And also, how do we mediate between conservation and welfare? So I'm going to use something called argument analysis to try to address this. Argument analysis is implemented by, most often by Dr. Michael Nelson at Oregon State and Dr. John Vucetich at Michigan Technological University. And they use this technique. It's an evaluation technique to break down and analyze arguments based on premises and conclusions that support conservation decisions. So basically, the breakdown of an argument, an ethical argument, you have an empirical premise, so something that is global, that is known, such as drunk driving endangers the life of others. You have an ethical premise, which is a value statement. You should not endanger the lives of others. And then you have a conclusion. Therefore, you should not drive drunk. And all ethical arguments are made up of premises and conclusions. And basically, your conclusion is appropriate based on how well the premises support your conclusion. So with argument analysis, you ask 3 questions. Are all of the premises that would be necessary to arrive at the conclusion present? Are all of them true or appropriate? And does the argument actually address the concern that originally gave rise to the argument in general? And so how this is done, and this is, sorry it's kind of blurry, is the resolution of the PDF, but to answer the first question, you take the original premises. So he works a lot on wolf hunting, and he breaks them down into more detailed premises. And you'll be able to see that better on this table because I adapted it so you can read it a bit better. And we use these premises and evaluate each one. So first what you do is you recognize all the premises, then you identify what kind. Is it an ecological, is it a sociological, is it an ethical statement? You determine whether it's true or appropriate, not subjectively, so that's using expert knowledge, and then you also identify if it's controversial. If something is true or appropriate but it's controversial, then you might have a public relations problem and not an ethics problem. So your conclusion is only as strong as your weakest premise, and a conclusion isn't necessarily deemed wrong or inappropriate just because a premise is. It might just be that you have the incorrect premise to support your conclusion. So going through this kind of order is the way that you take an argument and really analyze each detail of it and figure out what are the parts of this argument that we don't agree with. And so my plan is to use argument analysis to address the Pelorus Island case, to look at these quotes, these statements by different stakeholders, and analyze our arguments for or against this program. And what we'll be doing is using this, for the true or appropriate column, we're going to be using a compassionate conservation framework and using our 4 guiding principles to determine whether our premises are valid for the conclusion that each stakeholder has made. So again, going forward, I'll be going actually next week to Oregon State to work with Dr. Nelson in a conservation ethics workshop. also working with him specifically on my case study to work on our argument analysis, and looking at how compassionate conservation challenges our current conservation policy, how it challenges the decisions that have been made in this Pelorus Island program, and how the guiding principles of compassionate conservation can shift the way in which we address, analyze, and approach conservation challenges in such a human-induced world. This project I'm really looking forward to. It's something that I think can challenge anyone intellectually. It provides a framework to support not just emotions, which tends to happen a lot. Last night we were talking about emotional responses to hunting, and this gives you a framework in order to address the problems and the passion that goes into how we feel about conservation decisions being made in such a human-induced world. And I'd like to acknowledge so many people. Thank you to everybody at the center in Australia for supporting me. It's an amazing team of researchers there. The Green Collar staff, which is a consulting company that we worked with over in Cobar. The landholders, my assistant out in the field who helped me collect poop for 5 days. The Tufts Institute of the Environment who provided funding for my trip. Chris and Allison, of course, you guys are amazing. And Tracy, where are you? Oh, she's over there. And Tracy, and then also my former case study mentors. They paid a lot of attention to me over the year, and now I've changed my project, so I appreciate that they helped me and my classmates. And that's it for people with questions. Yeah.
So you changed your case study, but you came to you as to why you felt like you were now passionate about this. Is there kind of something you could summarize about like how you go forward, like as the new students, or if you could go back in time and figure out like a strategy for like finding a thing that you would be passionate about from the beginning, or do you think it's really more like kind of picking something and then figuring out exactly how you're going to be passionate about it based on the actual experience you're getting?
Yeah, so my original case study was also compassionate conservation focused. It was interesting, but I think that I don't know, I kind of happened upon this. It was really just, I spent the week out in the fields. I had some interactions with landholders that to me were really shocking. Just kind of statements, we kill these animals because they're not natural to here. I'm like, well, your merino sheep aren't natural either. So these kind of justifications that made it really difficult for me. And then actually, my mom's gonna laugh. I got into an argument with my uncle about hunting, and that really drove me mad. And I actually left work and laid in the park for 2 hours and was just like, what am I doing? And then I was like, I need to find a way to channel my frustrations and channel my energy into something that's gonna be productive and something that I think others can learn from. And I think that the argument analysis technique is really interesting, and it can be applied to other things that is not just conservation, and like I said, provides an avenue to address issues that we feel so passionately about with logic rather than just emotions. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lucas. I'm with the MCM class this year. I'm just wondering, are there any compassionate conservation movements here in the U.S.?
So the main center is in Sydney. We have a sister center that's developing in Israel, and Mark Beckoff, I think he's at Colorado State University. He's at, right? So you know Mark? Yeah. Yeah, so he is, oh you do? Okay. So he and I are in touch as well. And she would explain better, but he is also a leader in compassionate conservation and comments on many, many of these things. We actually didn't produce anything in the literature yet for this program because we wanted to we're an academic institution, not an activist group, so we want to make sure that we're going through things in an intellectual way, taking our time to really formulate opinion. But he wrote something in Psychology Today, I don't know if you read it, about this program.
About this one specifically?
Yeah, yeah. It's about a month and a half ago. Yeah.
Well, I believe that nature have an equilibrium, and when people introduce an external species, then it can transform into a pest. And then people again introduce another external species to try to control that pest. So that breaks the equilibrium. And that's why you think a lot of all different things to do, what to do. So what do you think is the right what we do? Get out all the not natural species, or just leave it there to continue growing?
So the mindset of the Center for Compassionate Conservation, and I don't want to speak for them because I'm not like the director or something, but the idea is that we recognize that all species are important.
Yes.
All animals are valuable, whether they're native or non-native, like you said, introduced or whatnot. And we have a pretty bad track record as humans for making things worse when we try to fix them. And so we want to use natural solutions like top-down species management, like reintroducing apex predators to manage the foxes and cats and rabbits, all introduced species in Australia. Also using livestock guardian dogs, like Catherine talked about, is really important for us as well. So trying to treat the landscape with compassion and empathy and blending ourselves in with nature, not just looking at it as another.
Okay,